Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome. My name is Michael Rosen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this conversation with Charles Taylor. I should say that this afternoon has been made possible by, thanks to the very generous support of the Government Department, the Department of Philosophy, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, the Committee on Social Studies, and not least the Colloquium on Intellectual History. So warm thanks to them all. It's, I should say also with my last personal note, a particular honor for me to welcome Charles Taylor, since he was, in fact, my own doctoral supervisor. So if I say we go back a year or two, you'll know what I mean. Now, I'm going to talk to Chuck, as I am going to call him, on the basis of long acquaintance, about his life and work. And so if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, and please, Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong, I'd just like to run through some of the outlines of Chuck's long and extraordinarily wide-ranging and productive career. I won't go into all of the honours, awards and distinctions that have been bestowed upon him, very rightly, because that would take up a good deal too much of our time. So Chuck was born in Montreal in 1931, and he comes from a family that was both Anglophone and Francophone. He graduated with first-class honours in history from McGill in 1952 and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, where he graduated in PPE in 1955. From 1955 to 1961, he was a Fellow of All Souls College, where he worked on his doctorate supervised by Isaiah Berlin. In 1961, he returned to teach at McGill, and he spent the 1960s as well as teaching and publishing. He published The Explanation of Behavior, based on his doctorate in 1964, fighting elections for the New Democratic Party and bringing up a family of 5 daughters. I'll mention only some of his writings, some that seem to me among the most significant of a very, very significant group. In 1971, an article that has remained seminal, Interpretation and the Sciences of Man. In 1975, a large and still massively important book on Hegel. It's, if I may interject, perhaps difficult for us to appreciate now quite what an act of unusual bravery it was to publish a large book on Hegel in those days. And if the climate has changed, which I think it definitely has, then not least thanks to Chuck. From 1976 to 1981, he was Chichely Professor of Social and Political Theory in Oxford, which is where I had the benefit of his teaching. And then he returned to Canada and McGill, though he's held visiting appointments in many other institutions. And in 1989, he published the first of his great books of what we call in German Geschichtsphilosophie, philosophical history, The Sources of the Self. In 1992, a long article, long contribution, which was, again, seminal, The Politics of Recognition, which I'm sure most of you know, more or less initiated debates on multiculturalism and its relation to liberalism. In 2007, a book which perhaps will be the capstone of a long and distinguished career, A Secular Age. Now, through all this time, Chuck has been the embodiment of the idea of an engaged philosopher, but not being a Québécois, or I'm not in a position to mention very much of his immense political activity, but I do want to record that he jointly chaired in 2007 the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, which Canadians will know was extraordinarily important in setting the compromise, I hope it's a durable compromise, upon which Quebec now operates.
embattled compromise.
Embattled compromise, thank you. As always, your choice of phrases is better than mine. With that outline in mind, I'd like to start a conversation now with Chuck, and I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your youth and background, because when I knew you, and reading your work before I got to know you, what was very distinctive about you as a member of the community of English-speaking philosophers is that you were someone who had a much more sympathetic view of traditions outside analytical philosophy than was common at that time. So I guess I want to ask you how far that goes back and whether you can say anything about the young Charles Taylor which led him to that straddle analytical and continental French and English culture.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the very beginning, because the family was bilingual from the beginning, and there were, relations on both sides and connections on both sides. So the idea of just thinking it out in English wasn't on the cards from the very beginning. But I think more specifically, it was actually going to Oxford, because I did history in the first degree at McGill. There I did philosophy, and at that time a kind of very low-level positivism was, the rage in philosophy in Oxford. And I kept saying, is this really philosophy? It seemed to me to be very thin, not to address any interesting questions. And then somebody came along and said, you should read this book. And they handed me Merleau-Ponty, Phénoménologie de la Perception. And I thought, wow, this was... So I got off onto the phenomenological tradition, not via Husserl, not via Heidegger, but via Merleau-Ponty. And then from there, one goes, in all directions, back to Hegel. I mean, Merleau-Ponty at one point said, everything in today's philosophy originates in Hegel. And I thought, well, that doesn't include the people I've been listening to in Oxford. But he was, he was right in a way. You see, if you take the continental scene, you either are people like Sartre, or there, obviously the en soi pour soi goes back to Hegel, and the Marxists and so on. And so that sort of captivated me and made me want to read Hegel, and then that's the road in.
So we're talking about you as as a second undergraduate, a senior undergraduate. Was this already happening when you were before? So did you? You've painted yourself as someone who was pushing against some of the dominant people at the time, and you ended up working with Isaiah Berlin, who I imagine was a skeptical but sympathetic person to work with. Did you have other people in Oxford who shared your skepticism and commitments? And
to some degree. I mean, there were some people that were directly connected to, like Alan Montefiore directly had links with French philosophy, but Stuart Hampshire was also somebody who was really not quite in the, in the mold. He was very interested in the sort of great period at the beginning after Descartes, Spinoza, and so on. And he wrote a book on Spinoza. But they were few and far between. There were just a few people that you could talk to. Richard Wollheim wrote a book on Bradley. There were people here and there. But the mass of if you like, tutors, philosophy tutors, were very much in the same mold. Later on, when I went back in 76 to 81, we had this big fight to widen the syllabus, right? And
I remember it well.
You remember it well. So we invented this new paper, optional paper, post-Kantian philosophy, which would include, lots of people, but it include Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, then up to Heidegger and so on. And we were finally given permission to put it on the syllabus, but not for PPE, only for the philosophy and modern language, because these were very small schools, right? Whereas PPE had just a mass of undergraduates. And so our colleagues had this terrifying thought that as college tutor in X college, 20 people would be at the door saying, please teach us Hegel, and teach us Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and they just couldn't face that. So that it was allowed in, but it's still only allowed for these minor schools, and we had to have a census every year to prove we were enough people who would volunteer to teach this particular paper.
Well, I'm glad to tell you that things have changed somewhat since then.
Okay.
Indeed, when I was an Oxford Don, I made a living out of all those people whose students were knocking on the door. But it was, I remember vividly, and it was quite extraordinary that people would make a case that you could study philosophy and modern languages without studying the philosophy that was done in France and Germany. So one name that came to me, to whom you haven't mentioned, but who's often thought of, well, I would think of him when I was an undergraduate and reading. People were critical of various kind of standard accounts of social science, was Alistair MacIntyre. Was he someone with whom you had interaction?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, he wasn't there at the same time as me, but we were very close. It was the founding of the New Left Review and New Left meetings that we had in the latter half of the 50s. We were both very involved with that. And so I got to know Alistair very, very early on. And I must say, he's been an inspiration to me the whole length of my career. He's always coming out with a new book, which is something very interesting. But we didn't happen to ever coincide in Oxford itself. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And I actually thank you for that, because you've actually got to the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. I knew that you were involved in what then became the New Left Review. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about it, and perhaps remembering that not everyone is an older generation or knows about the UK, how did that happen and what was it?
Well, that was the response to quite a crisis in Europe, crisis in the world. 1956, on one hand, you had the invasion of Suez by the French and British, right, and they were having to draw back because of Eisenhower. At the same time, the same year, you had the Hungarian uprising and the crushing of it, right? So there was a massive movement of a lot of younger people, on one hand, to be somewhat disenchanted with Western social democracy for a variety of reasons, but on the other hand, the people who had been admirers of the Soviet system, people who had been members of the Communist Party, also came out in droves, right? So there was a great attempt, let's rethink the whole of the left, the whole of the socialist enterprise, and in a certain sense, we, for postgraduates at Oxford, set up something which turned out to channel a lot of that in the UK, right? But there were four of us who were just graduate students at Oxford that got this idea. I suppose it was really Rafe Samuel who had the tremendous entrepreneurship to set up a magazine, start a coffee house in London connected to the magazine. And that was the Universities in the Left Review, it was called, later New Left. And we got the word New Left from a corresponding movement in France, La Nouvelle Gauche with Claude Bourdet and so on. We took the name, and of course it's been used since, at different moments, different things are new, right? So it's been used since, but that was a launching pad for a lot of very interesting thought and action and organization.
So had you been active in politics before you came to Britain?
Yes, I mean, I've always been politically engaged in one way or the other. I didn't run or anything like that until afterwards, but I've always been a member of a party.
And always forgive me, the New Democratic Party goes back that far and you were a member?
No, it doesn't go back. It was founded in '61, but it had a predecessor party, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, But the actual present avatar, if you like, of Canadian social democracy was founded in 1961. And I came back, and that's the point on which I came back from my first period in Oxford and was at the founding convention.
So you've been, if I may say so, a social democrat, man and boy.
More or less. No, I was a teenage liberal. Yeah. Because the liberals in Quebec were locked in combat with a very reactionary party, Union Nationale, clericalist, And so I joined them first. But then I thought through what my social philosophy, if you like, and edged leftward roughly at that time.
Well, that might actually be a good point to start talking about your social philosophy. So you would sum yourself up as a social democrat, not a liberal? Is that a fair...
Yes. I mean, what's the difference? Well, the important difference is that I think, take the most general possible description of this, if you have the intuition that our democracies are unhinged or imbalanced because there's much too great control by people with money, by large corporations and so on, and that is producing a number of real pathologies in our societies. I mean, I think great inequality is a pathology. It's not just something that it's a misfortune. It produces all sorts of very bad consequences. As a matter of fact, it produces very even surprising bad consequences. If you read The Spirit Level, a very interesting book by a couple of British researchers, you see that very unequal societies have not only something that you would expect, I mean, lack of social trust and a great sense of alienation, so on, but they also have very often other forms of mental health that don't seem to correlate with great inequalities. I mean, people sometimes say, what does it matter if everybody has enough, if a lot of people have a lot more? Well, it matters because we live in societies, namely democratic societies, where that kind of division, that kind of great inequality produces all sorts of distortions, including, of course, distortions in power, which in the end mean that not everybody has enough. I mean, that production of that kind of division. But in any case, it makes for a very unhealthy democracy, and which, the most unequal of the advanced democracies in the West is this one. The most conflictual, about to fly apart in the West, is this one. And this correlation is not an accident. So very early on, this is one of the basic thoughts that I had. I thought we need to have the society rebalanced more. And that means, of course, a more developed welfare state. It means having vibrant trade unions who can fight back and negotiate back. And it means having certain kinds of planning which will offset, for instance, the worst consequences of globalization and so on. So it means a number of these things, and it means different policy recommendations at different moments because the different issues are central. But the basic thought that Western democracies in general slide towards an imbalance in which there's too much power at the, if you like, economic top. It seems to me to be true now as it was then, truer now than it was then. Because we were after a long period of relatively social democratic policies, even though some of them were carried out by coalition governments in Europe at the end of the war. And since 1980, we've definitely been sliding in the other direction in a very remarkable way. And of course, the cause and the consequence of this is greater income inequality and greater wealth inequality. We were at the nadir of income inequality in the modern industrial West, I think at the end of after the Second World War. The French call it les 30 glorieuses, the 30 great years after the war. And since 1980, we've been moving in the other direction. This is pretty obvious, and we're now at spectacular inequalities.
Well, I was going to actually ask you about that because, the time when you went into politics was right in the heart of les 30 glorieuses. Things have changed very radically since then. But basically you think, as it were, now more than ever, that we need, that you haven't, as it were, revised your views about how we should.
No, I'm on the contrary.
They've been reinforced by the
yes.
by developments that. Well, now that's to talk about social inequality, and of course, in Quebec, perhaps not even in before 1961, but certainly from the 60s onwards, there's been another axis of politics, which has been politics of community, of language, of nationhood. Did you have views about that early, and have your views, as it were, changed much over the years?
Well, there's been the evolution, but the basis of it is very much the same. I've always been someone who is a very strong believer in, if you like, the Quebec identity in Canada. So that Canada is really a very strange country, and Americans would have trouble understanding it. We barely understand it, and but it's a plurinational or a multinational society. I mean, there are three sites where people want to invoke sovereignty in Canada as against a single people having sovereignty. One is, of course, the country as a whole. The other is, in Quebec, the idea of a society which remains part of Canada but is very much its own fate and its own mission, if you like, to maintain this French-speaking society. And then, of course, Aboriginal communities also enjoy a certain kind of sovereignty. And this has not been accepted all the time in our history, but it's come to be the accepted notion of Canada now. So I was always in Quebec, if you like, a very strong Quebec nationalist, but also a federalist, that is. And the idea that we in Quebec can best express this sovereignty and our task of developing the society by stepping out of Canada, I've been against that. But the idea that it just be seen as a province like the others, I'm also don't accept.
It's very interesting. I mean, one of the, it's very interesting to me that the words you used included sovereignty and nationhood, rather than culture. And I must say, as someone who finds myself rather bewildered, very bewildered by these things, I often wonder, is culture nation writ small? Is nation culture writ large? And of course, it's a problem in Quebec, but it's a problem in a lot of other nation states, not least the one from which I hail at the moment. How do we determine what constitutes a nation in your sense? You say there are three. How could you tell if there were more than? I mean, how could we tell in Britain whether Scotland is a nation, whether Wales is a nation? What makes one a nation?
Well, Renan was right. I mean, a nation is something that you can't find, if you like, purely objective criteria for. It's something that is part of of the self-understanding of a community over history, that it sees itself as a nation. So it sees itself as having a common fate, right? That it goes well for everybody or it goes ill for everybody, that kind of common fate over history. Now, nations are forced to redefine themselves. That's one of the important things that happens in our history because the people change. Even the descendants of the original people don't have the same outlook very often. But particularly in our day, because of migration, nations are called upon to really fully integrate people that don't belong to the original culture, which, as it were, at the origin everybody in that nation shared. Right? So the phenomenon that we call in Canada multiculturalism, or in Quebec interculturalism, for a variety of reasons, is a very important change that national societies have to go through because of migration, because of the immense fact of intercontinental, interstate migration. But that is going to be an element of continuity. In a sense, this is something that should be understood right here very well, because we've always been a nation of immigrants, right, in which people have come from non-WASP originally origins, and people have become part of this broader American nation. That's one thing that you really do understand, which our friends in Europe don't very often understand, right? That they're quite happy to invite in a lot of Gastarbeiter to Germany from Turkey or elsewhere, and then they get very nervous and talk about a Leitkultur, a leading culture, and we've got to watch these people. They don't quite see that one belongs to the other. But so to get back to this very fuzzy, long explanation for what is a nation. A nation is something to do with the self-understanding of the community, of its having a common fate over history, but the actual markers of it very often have to change in order for it to go on being a democratic nation, an equal nation, a just nation.
But I mean, it's not just migration that has caused that to be so problematic in the past.
That's right. That's something.
Think of Yugoslavia, for instance, when it was, after the First World War, there was no doubt that Yugoslavia was a nation. The question was it going to have political sovereignty, with the breakup of the Habsburg Empire and so on. And then there was the question. So we've witnessed, without, I think, huge amounts of migration, the breakup of what had previously been seen as a sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And I fear that sort of thing is not unique.
But that's another kind of phenomenon which is very important, which is not absent from our society in Canada. That is, you have a nation which is in a sense a multi-nation. Yugoslavia was constituted by societies that consider themselves nations. Serbia, Croatia, others less so, but had less powerful consciousness of that, but the main constituents had that. So you have these societies which are, in one sense, national society because they supposedly have this sense of common fate overarching these different groups, but the different groups had a very strong sense of national history. Like the Serbs, they have this famous, they defined themselves by this terrible defeat, Kosovo Polja, which, but nevertheless they defined themselves by that, and they, from that point of view, are also a nation. So that's another issue that a modern nation very often has to resolve. Can there be a sense of multinational in a single nation? That's one of the problems that's been constantly facing Canada. And these attempts can fail, as we have in the case of Yugoslavia. They fail, they fall apart.
Thank you. I thought we might head back to philosophy. This is also philosophy, of course, because you don't have an austere, narrow linguistic conception of the subject, so I certainly don't need to apologise for in bringing politics into philosophy, but something more formally philosophical, which is your first book and your interest in the explanation of behaviour. That was a central preoccupation for the first 10, 15 years of your philosophical career, and it's continued since. Do you want to say a little bit about how you came to it and what you see of it as being its essential kernel?
Yeah, but I think that among the things that sort of got to me by the philosophy I was taught as an undergraduate at Oxford, which is really the tradition of Hobbes, Locke, Hume, and so on, was that you could see this tradition being continued in behaviorist psychology. In a sense, there's the same picture. Here's the subject being acted on by things that impinge from outside and then responding to that. And the whole formula of behaviorism as it was then with Skinner and Hull and others had the same kind of form, but the idea was you would even get rid of the mind, you go even farther, and you simply have this in terms of stimulus-response correlations. So I thought this was maybe a good place to start to undercut that entire mode of thinking. And so the argument of that book was that you really can't come to understand what's going on with human beings without teleology and intentionality, that is, without a sense of purpose and without understanding that the world appears in a certain way to this subject, that subject, that the way in which they take things in has to be factored into the explanation. So in a sense, that was it was the opening salvo in a long series of attempts. Then when I came back to Canada after Oxford, I landed up by accident in a political science department. It's a very complicated story. So I began to do the whole argument, with what was called behavioralism, another extra syllable in there, that the kind of dominant number crunching notion of political science, comparative politics without culture, and so on and so on. And I'll have to redo the argument. So explanation of the science of man comes from that. You could say that the single short slogan is no really good and interesting social science without some hermeneutic dimension, that is interpretation of what is going on. And so it's been a long battle, which can be fought out in different terms within sociology, within political science, within anthropology, even though anthropologists generally understand this, social anthropologists very well. I mean, ethnography is a very important part of that, and all interesting ethnographies are attempts at interpretation. So it's the one civilized social science from my point of view. That is, I mean, majority civilized social science. But in the other cases, you had for a long period this more interpretive trend was very minority and persecuted in some cases and so on. You were invoking the expression, that's not philosophy. Well, that would by narrow, but it's in the same way, people say, that's not political science, that's not sociology, etc. And I think it's been a slow gain of this tradition in the intervening years, but it's still a fight, still a hard slog. There still are people that resist this. And so that was really the beginning point in a continuing battle.
So you've often talked in later years, I don't know when about a generic approach to understanding human beings that you call naturalism. So that comes from this kind of picture that you get in behaviorism in psychology, and you think that extends to pretty much all attempts to do quantitative social science.
Yeah, I mean, quantitative social science has its place within a larger argument, which is hermeneutical. But the thought that you can leave that hermeneutical side out, that is a very powerful. I mean, you can understand why it's powerful because, why I use the word naturalism, which is maybe a bad word, but what it means is people who aspire to do social science or human science in general with the methods and with the restrictions that natural science has, that we normally understand, being part of natural science, where teleology and intentionality have no place in physics or chemistry and so on. So the tremendous successes of these natural sciences, the fact that every year somebody gets a Nobel Prize for some achievement and so on, which is very clearly an achievement and no one can deny it's an achievement. If you're in humanities, you get a sense of why it would be great, to have that kind of sense of achievement and so on, unquestionable achievement in my field of history, of sociology and so on. And so the temptation is very, very, the concept of human beings as having power, as standing out and being able to transform their world, know what they're doing. We transform the world, but we don't always know what we're doing, which we can see with the present situation. That whole conception of oneself is very seductive for a lot of people. It's very, very powerful. You go into the faculty club and you see all these physicists there, and you're just a political scientist, and you just made the last prediction. It turned out to be totally wrong. And they say, "Didn't you say that Hillary was going to win the?" No.
That's a sensitive subject around here. Yes.
See, so you'd like to be like that, and we have these methods now which can, by putting aside all this woolly stuff about.
So you did say though that provided that there's a hermeneutic dimension, perhaps provided the hermeneutic dimension has, you might even say, priority, there's a place for quantitative methods in social
Well, obviously,
science.
Some things are quantitative, like number of votes and so on and so on. But so you have a complex argument. That's that is one of the difficulties. It's like, I mean, think of what it is to be a historian. You want to say that this is the, why did the First World War break out? What people are always talking about. You have to operate on several levels, bring a lot of different things together in an argument in order to give your picture of why the First World War happened, or why democracies are going so wrong these days. You have to move at several levels, and the interpretive ones, if you like, are crucial to that, but not alone.
Great, and that brings me then to another philosophical theme. I'm not going to date it exactly because you said you go back to Merleau-Ponty, but you've been very interested in accounts of the mind and human action, and particularly about the role of interpretation in that.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about self-interpreting beings, but could I invite you to say a little bit about that and how that fits into your broader picture?
Yeah, and I think that human beings operate by, in one sense, interpretation, and that is, we all live by, or different cultures live by, different understandings of what it is to be family beings, sexual beings, beings with some kind of religious or moral aspiration. All these different things are understood very differently in the languages of different cultures, right? And so you only really understand what's going on in these very, very different cultures by understanding that they've got another way of living and interpreting and understanding certain of the constants of human life, like family life and political life and so on. So the issue is always, can you come to some kind of grasp of what's going on here, even though initially you don't have the vocabulary, there aren't really good interpretations or good translations of these concepts. I mean, you note that very often, in order to understand a very different culture, what an ethnographer will do, or historian or anthropologist will do, will be to give you the word, taboo, seppuku, whatever, and then try to surround it with a lot of explanation and so on in order to give you a sense of what it means. But you don't end up with a word in modern English or French or whatever, which is a really perfect translation of it. And of course, even within European languages, you get something of this kind of thing, but because we have so much in common in our background in European languages, in our historic background, these words fairly well travel. I mean, they become des faux frères, we say in French, that very often they look as though they're exactly the same concept in this language and that, but it turns out that you make terrible mistakes when you apply them like that. But grosso modo, you can overcome that. Whereas when we're dealing with entirely different cultures with very little common history with ours, you have to immerse yourself and get some kind of understanding, and in the end you get an understanding that does without real, ordinary, satisfying translation. Right? You don't get the words. You very often invoke the word in the original and then have a lot of explanation around it. But I think that's part of the human condition. I mean, it's very interesting and very, in a certain sense, unsettling if you want to get a final understanding of human beings, that they have this capacity, almost that they're condemned to this capacity to interpret and over time reinterpret what they're doing, so that you never can get to the final set of motivations and just list them and say that's what human beings are. But I think that's that is a limitation can't be overcome. It has to be accepted.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And I can see we've got a full audience and no one's leaving. So let's talk about Hegel. What brought you to work? I mean, I was an undergraduate, and you mentioned my undergraduate tutor, Alan Montefiore, your friend. He told me when I was an undergraduate that his Canadian friend, Charles Taylor, was working on a large book on Hegel. And I thought, wow, because I knew your work from the explanation of behavior, from various essays, but I hadn't pegged you as a Hegel scholar. What turned you into a Hegel scholar?
Well, I was born into a Hegel scholar. In a certain sense. I mean, in the following, well, born, I mean, it's too strong. But my first degree was in history, as I said. And that's been something that's been very central to my understanding of what, understanding of what the intellectual task is of understanding human beings. We're historical figures, and we can only understand each other historically. So I wanted to do something which was really between history and philosophy, with some sociology, with a lot of stuff mixed up. But history and philosophy were going to be. Now, the person who really did this first and best, I mean, best not forever, but the first person really to do this seriously was Hegel. That is, we take account of, I mean, not just look back on Plato and Aristotle and say, what have they got to teach us in a kind of timeless way, talking philosophy, and the thesis from Plato and that thesis from Epicurus and so on. But to see that, to argue that, different things were going on then, different issues were at stake then, and then it developed in this way and that way, and we are finally where we are today. So if you want to do that kind of thing, you should start off with Hegel, but not end with Hegel. You don't agree in the end, but it's something that's immensely useful to wrestle with. I mean, where do you stand vis-a-vis Hegel is a good thing, good set of issues to wrestle with if you want to do that kind of thing.
So when did you start on the book, and how long did it take you?
Oh, I hate to admit this. I mean, I started in the book.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're with friends.
No, just quite a long time. No, I started when I left Oxford as my undergraduate life at Oxford. I already had the contract to write this book. But then running for Parliament really takes a lot of time. Running for Parliament, organizing the party in Quebec, losing elections, all these things took up a lot of time. So,
not to mention your family.
Plus the family, plus everything else. So it came out in 75, 15 years later.
Oh,
okay.
Not long.
Not long. Okay.
So for those who don't know this wonderful book, I think it's fair to say that you embrace then what I called in the German word Geschichtsphilosophie. That's not philosophy of history in this way of philosophy of law or philosophy of art, but as it were, philosophy done historically, or history done philosophically.
Historically inflected philosophy, yeah.
So that's something that you embraced. Where is your criticism
of Hegel? Oh, I mean, the thing is just too neatly tied up together in the end. See, he has a notion of reason that it would be, if it were correct, would deny what I just said a few minutes ago, that we're never going to get the ultimate final story which will enable us to understand people of all cultures, including the ones to come that we have yet to experience. And in a certain sense, the concept of reason that Hegel is offering there, it promises that, right? So, particularly in his idea that we have various ways of understanding the human condition and even its development and history. There is art, there's religion, and there's philosophy. And in the case of art and religion, we have a series of images. I mean, images in one sense in art, and another sense in religion. He thinks of it as a series of stories. He's really thinking of like the Genesis story and so on. And this captures the truth, but it doesn't make it totally transparent and clear. Whereas when you get the philosophical interpretation of that, you do get the thing quite transparent and clear. It's that, see, this is why, I mean, I'll throw in something more here. I'm fascinated, and always have been, by the Romantic period, right? And there you have Hegel, who gets his problem from the Romantic period, from the sense of the breakdown of an earlier sense of religion and philosophical certainty, and then trying to recover something like that. And he breaks with the rest of them, because the rest of them, the early Schelling and so on, thought that you could only reach some kind of understanding of this if you, in the realm of art, or people, Friedrich Schlegel saying you need a mythology. He breaks with them and says, no, we can get a fully rational grasp. And so he takes through all the themes of the Romantic period in a very interesting way, but brings them to this kind of final resolution. And I just think that's, sorry, Hegel, that's not all. I mean, that just, it cannot be.
Well, thank you. And that's actually very helpful for me, because I wanted to bring you towards some of your own later writings. And I think it's fair to say that both in Sources of the Self and in The Secular Age, you've had a go to give your own grand conspectus of intellectual history, or as it were, history seen from an intellectual point of view. And what's holding it together is a secularization narrative. How would you... Hegel's is also, in a sense, a secularization narrative.
Yeah.
But a secularization narrative which doesn't just leave us in a situation of kind of hopeless yearning for a lost unity, but gives us a chance, apparently, to reintegrate ourselves thanks to a new or recovered kind of philosophical reason.
Yeah.
If you don't buy that, are you a hopeless romantic? Are you someone who simply says, well, we've lost all that authenticity of the past and we can just sort of sit looking back pessimistically? That's a very rude way of putting it. But how would you say that your account of the secularization process, if it's not Hegel, is it therefore by default romantic?
In this one sense that I've been arguing, but not in other senses. I mean, in the one sense that you can't get a final definitive understanding which will never be improved, but not in another sense, because, well, there is a way in which Hegel is in line with the standard secularization story of the post-war period, Second World War period, with which I take issue with in the book, The Secular Age. He's in line with that in that the picture of Christianity is very much a kind of secularized one that he offers in the end, and watered down in a certain sense. And I don't see things that way. But this doesn't mean that we are any more hopelessly divided from ourselves than we were. We've always been. I mean, there's always been a certain inability to put everything together in a totally harmonious way in human life. But that I see the rise of the Western secular age as consisting of something different, consisting in a if you like, a shift of spiritual life from societies which are all organized around one confession, or in the American exceptionalism was to be organized around a kind of diffuse Protestant Christianity, and then even that departed from as you move forward in history. But in the standard European case, it was confessional societies. Everybody belonged to the same confession. So religious life is led in this kind of totally national community form to a world in which it is very, very different, but there's a kind of fragmentation of that. On the other hand, very, very vigorous spiritual life in all sorts of different ways, which have to coexist with each other. So that, to take the idea from Robert Billa that very much influenced me, that nothing is ever lost, is the famous phrase that he throws into his great book on religion and human evolution. You have these forms recur, but they now existing in another kind of context in modern West and in very many other levels of world society, because what the kind of pluralism that exists in modern Western societies is echoed at another level in, you might say, globalizing cities, even though these may be Rio or Sao Paulo or Mumbai and so on, this kind of side-by-side of very, very different religious and spiritual positions or anti-spiritual in some cases positions. But centrally, as in whole societies, we see this in the modern West. We now have this kind of pluralism in which it isn't the case of here's a religious form that existed then and has totally disappeared, but rather a case of here's a religious form, if you like, that used to be dominant and englobing everyone, which is broken up. That form can still exist. Those churches still exist, but they are one among many. So it's another kind of position in which human spirituality is working its way out, and you have to see this in the context of these tremendous shifts in history between the situation that you would have in 5th century India at the time of the Upanishads and the Buddha, the situation that you had in China, the situation that you have in some Muslim societies, and they're very different from each other. They have to see how we in the West constitute another kind of situation of coexistence, which is in some ways very new, particularly in that the option of non-belief and anti-belief is very much alive and part of the mix and part of the dynamic.
Well, that's really helpful and interesting, and it brings us to another topic, which you've already mentioned. I mean, we're living, and certainly in the last few years, and certainly in this country, but I think not just, in times when people have a sense that liberalism and democracy are much less robust than they believe them to be. This may, of course, be because they're young people who've grown up in times when things were, much less challenging than they had been, for instance, in the years after of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, and that something of the sense of fragility. How would you see things? Do you see things as fragile? Do you see this as, or do you see us as simply going through, a normal cycle of change?
No, I think they're very fragile, and therefore what we're seeing now is one of our fragilities, I talk about degeneration, all organisms are susceptible to degeneration. The human organism can take certain diseases and degenerate in one or other way through these diseases. I think our form of political society, democracy, has built into it certain dangers, certain degenerations. And I think what we're seeing today in what people call populism is really two of these that are coming together. One is that to go back to the beginning when I was talking about social democracy, there's a perpetual tendency, I think, to slide away from an equal society, to slide towards a society where power becomes unequal, wealth becomes unequal, and these feed on each other. And there's therefore one danger of moving away from democracy in that respect. But there's another feature, another dimension of democracies that we can't do without, which is a very strong sense of common identity. Democracies need that. I mean, everyone said this since Aristotle on, that free societies need a certain kind of identification by the citizens, what was called virtue, and Montesquieu called la vertu, or political virtue, because as free societies, people have to be willing to act, to participate, to agree to redistribution and so on without being forced. And so we need this kind of strong common identity. But these strong common identities are very easily turned into excuses for division. That is, what is it to be? I mean, most modern democratic identities have two facets. There are certain principles of a democracy, equality, inclusion, and a certain sense of patriotic attachment to a certain historic project, the American project, the Canadian project, the British project, the German project, and so on. And these can easily turn to exclusion. The principles can be, I think, easily turned into a kind of moralizing form in which certain people who are citizens are shown not to be really citizens. I mean, take the famous speech of Romney in that election in 2012 about the 47% who are really not pulling their weight. They're really, this, of course, judgment is behind the remarkable fact about Republicans in this society and what conservatives have become in my society. They're degenerated into attempts to vote suppression, right, are justified because these people aren't really, not really living up to the ethic of citizenship, right? So that's one way you can get this deviation of the very strong common bond. And the other way, of course, is that the particular historical project can get attached to a certain ethnic group, right? And so people who are not in the ethnic group are not part of our, our attempt. Or, you get in France at the moment the use of the notion of laïcité, which is part of their principles, right? Principal part. The use of their notion of laïcité turned around so that, kids wearing the hijab in school are no longer allowed to wear the hijab, and even the mothers who wear the hijab can't go out on the school expeditions, etc. Right? So you get this kind of deviation in which you take the principle and you turn it around in such a way as to exclude. Now, I think this is a perpetual danger. It's always going to be there. So that democracies have to work very hard to stop these two dangers from happening. There are others too. The thing about populism is that it's the point where they intersect, right? Where the present day populism, where dissatisfaction at inequality and that kind of economic exclusion gets taken up by xenophobic movements, which are part of the second deviation. So you get, Trump is telling people in Appalachia that he's going to get them all jobs, which is untrue, but what he's really getting them to vote for him for is all of those elites that are favoring these other people over you, who are genuine Americans, and you're not getting, or Madame Le Pen, the same kind of thing, Gerstvilders in Holland, the same kind of thing, and a certain amount of Brexit, was the same kind of, one of the indices.
Also Quebec?
Definitely Quebec. That's why I said in battle. We have another fight in our hands. We just elected a government that wants to go back to banning hijabs and we're going to fight them every inch of the way. But we win some, lose some. I don't want to lose this one. So
more strength to your arm.
What's that?
More power to your arm.
Well, I hope. Brave words, but anyway, this is the nature of living in a democratic society. You never can say, we've made it. I've made it. There's too much self-congratulation in a lot of our societies. Your society, very often. America, great. Chrétien, great. Canada is great. No. We've just survived not doing that. No, let's keep... We've got to keep our vigilance up. I think this is the situation we really are in. So it's not surprising. We haven't just arrived at a moment when suddenly we're degenerating. We've arrived at a moment in which some of our ticks and dangers and so on are suddenly getting together and making life very hard for us. But that's part of the course. You've got to pick up and go, see clearly what's happening and then start fighting.
Well, I'm going to open things to the floor in a little minute, but I still have one question that I've been saving up because I really want to ask it. It must be apparent to even those people who haven't read Chuck's work that yours has been an incredible career of continuity, of expansion, of taking new ideas into different areas, but also consistency. I wonder if there's anything that you can look back and say, I've changed my mind about that.
Oh, there are lots of things. I don't want to go on about them. I even certain clauses of the Bouchard-Taylor report I now regret, and so on, the way things have worked out, which I've told. I've announced this and so on. But in other cases it's not as spectacular, but I've certainly put things differently. I didn't have the particular take on it that I now have, because I think you gradually come to see. You know, I wouldn't have been able to spell hermeneutics back in Oxford when I was reacting against what I was taught. But then you get, so there've been moments when I've, you know, Ricoeur, for instance, is somebody that I'm really tremendously inspired by, but he wasn't there at the very beginning when I was reading Merleau-Ponty, right? But I learned new ways of putting it, reading him.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a start, but we're not letting you off that lightly. I'd like to ask for questions from the floor. We have, who's got a microphone? Priya, you have a microphone. Is there someone who's able to take a microphone there? So, yeah, Larry. This one is on. So who will ask the first question? I'm looking at.
That's a hand.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Muriel Rouillet. I'm a French professor of political science. I will take your word for the French Republicans. What would be your advice to current French Republicans? I tend to agree with you that some of us have become a bit exclusionary or exclusive. Some of my former friends have become so. I'm very sorry about that. And if I can take your word back to France to carry the good word of Charles Taylor, where you are a star, that would be good. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, you know, this battle is going on among historians in France. Jean Bobéreau is somebody who has really written remarkably well on that issue. His point being that there were these two tendencies right back there in 1904, 1905. There was Bercombe, who was really just wanting to restrict the scope of and maybe push to the wall Catholicism. And then you get, I mean, a figure like Jean Jaurès, whom I immensely admire for other reasons as well, because this is a social democrat who had this very clear idea that liberté de conscience is one of the really important concepts. So these two different readings of laïcité, and in our report, of course, which is naturally written in French and which Jean Bobéreau helped to inspire us, and we were arguing really with our French colleagues as well as with our Quebec colleagues, we took up this particular reading, his reading. You know, so there's this book that produced by my research assistant Jocelyn Maclure and myself, Laïcité et Liberté de Conscience, in which we sort of lay out. But I don't take credit for this. This is Bobéreau being channeled through some fast learning.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello. Is this on? Yeah, it's on. My name is Zion Weir. I'm a high school senior, and I've done a lot of my own research outside of the subjects I'm studying on, stuff like economics, philosophy, politics. Just want to make sure I heard you right. You said that one of the threats to democracy was income inequality. Is that correct?
One of the very unfortunate things that is growing in our democracy. Yeah.
And you said if you want to keep your democracy, you got to get rid of the inequality. Correct? Who's going to pay for that? I know you mentioned we need a better welfare state, but how do you foot the bill for a welfare state that big?
Well, you pay for it one way or the other, right? Because if you allow people to develop such a high degree of infant mortality and other kinds of things of that kind, if you let children grow up in poverty so that they become, in a certain sense, wards of the state, you're going to pay one way or the other. Right? So in order to have a really healthy society, you have to, it's a much more human way to pay up front by paying taxes.
But what happened?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean the countries that are have quite high tax rates are more efficient in many ways economically than the U.S., which has low tax rates. I mean, They retrain people so they don't become simply receivers of unemployment insurance, and they have a much healthier society, so they don't have to cope with that. You have, it's a myth widely believed in America that you have the most efficient economy in the world. I mean, you have a lot of very interesting innovation in America, some of which is very, very economically powerful, and that's why, of course, your president is talking very much about protecting intellectual property, but you haven't got that efficient an economy.
Okay, but wouldn't that kind of benefit state, that kind of like taxing people more to pay for the underprivileged, wouldn't that? I know you also talked a lot about freedom. Wouldn't that take away freedom because it would undermine a citizen's freedom to control how much money they make, since the government's just gonna take it all away, or take a good chunk of it away, and then give it away via the benefit system?
Well, you see, the government has to take a certain amount away because you don't get the economy working at all. I mean, who's going to build the roads? Who's going to, you know, of course, defend the frontiers and so on? There are certain expenses which are necessary, which a lot of producers, a lot of the producing units are shirking paying their share of. Now, if they don't pay it, then you get various kinds of pathologies that are very costly. For instance, if you retrain somebody when they lose their job because of globalization and so on, they then become fully productive worker. If you don't, they live on the edges on food stamps and so on. They get various diseases. They can't bring up their children with all the conditions. So there's a payoff to repairing that unemployment by paying for, and the payoff, which can be actually measured in productivity, and that is what has to happen. What you have now in the United States, particularly with this, well, there's going to be apparently a new bill lowering taxes. You had a ridiculous bill passed a few months ago or a year ago, which is going to greatly increase the American deficit, and which gives disproportionate relief to the very rich. That both increases inequality, produces an immense problem of at some point facing the deficit, and at the same time leaves a lot of people in dire conditions where they aren't really giving their best.
Dan?
I'm Daniel Roberts, a first-year graduate student in the Department of Government. So you wrote an essay some time ago on neutrality in political science, how empirical or positive work is not value neutral, not just in the sense that value can inform the topics you study, but in the sense that positive results or results about the political world that comment on theoretical frameworks can actually condition what sorts of normative value systems are credible or respond to variations in the real world that are actual. So it's someone who's embarking on a career in positive political science. Do you think there are any kind of areas of the political world that political scientists neglect that would kind of comment on seemingly incontrovertible issues from a normative values perspective?
Well, I mean, there aren't incontrovertible issues in value. I mean, we have these battles all the time. So what I was trying to say in that paper is, don't think that you're offering some knowledge about the society which is totally value-free, that is not taking sides. On the contrary, a lot of the theoretical terms that you'll be using are connected to vocabularies which only make sense because they're of certain values, right? Of certain normative positions. We're always arguing out of series of concepts that are connected to normative positions. So there isn't such a thing as, I mean, you can present sort of particular facts that, you know, the Columbus discovered, whatever, in 1492, or the GNP at this moment of the United States is so and so. But if you want to start explanatory theory, and you want to get into concepts that are going to explain what's happening, you're going to be using concepts that have close connections to evaluative concepts. And then you're, as it were, within a certain value position and operating in that. So you're not really free from.
Thank you. My name is Katrina Forrester. I teaching government and social studies here. Stuart Hall tells a story, and I think I've heard it from. Stuart Hall tells a story about how you brought back the Marx's 1844 manuscripts back to the UK and translated them in the late 50s. And I wondered if you could speak a little about what that moment of the rediscovery of Marx was like in the late 50s in Britain, and also why or what motivated you and indeed Hall to move away from the humanistic Marx and maybe towards Hegel at the time that many others were picking up on Marx in the 60s. And perhaps if you could talk about the relevance of those set of ideas today.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm sorry I didn't hear the first part because I had a little crisis in I hope.
You were being praised for bringing.
Well, I think my mic here began to fall away. So, but yeah, to get to the end of what you were saying, the latter part, I was very interested in the manuscripts of 1844. I wrote about them at the time, and that was very much my take on what was interesting in Marxism. Now, what you had shortly after that was Louis Althusser, or, you know, that whole development of this very hard line, scientistic Marxism, which I had absolutely no sympathy with at all. So I was, and I wasn't. It wasn't so much moving away from Marx towards Hegel, if you like. Hegel was the origin of that kind of. I mean, Marx was really much reflecting certain features in Hegel when he was writing those. I mean, what the remarkable figure there is György Lukács, right? This Hungarian who really almost reinvented, or as it were, reached back and interpreted what Marx must have said in history and class consciousness 15 years before the manuscripts were actually rediscovered. It's very, very interesting that so very much Hegel influenced thinker looking at Marx had a sense of what must have been involved in that position, even though it hadn't got the manuscripts hadn't been, as it were, edited up.
Can I just ask, is it true that you brought the 1844 manuscripts back to the UK in the late 50s? And that you were is it true that you brought the 1844?
I didn't. No. It was. These were. I mean, it was the 1930s. I think that. See, I think it was part. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's part of the big Gesamtausgabe, the total publication of all Marx's work. They were working through the manuscripts, and finally they came. When did they? Do you remember when they came? I think it was the 1930s that they.
I think they were published separately, but don't sue me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, it was after Lukács wrote in.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But in the English.
Sorry, but
They weren't translated into English until the 60s.
Yeah, so Stuart Hall tells the story. This is the beginning of my question, was that Stuart Hall tells a story that you were the person who translated the manuscripts into English in 1958, and that's how they became circulated among the first British New Left. And I wondered whether that was true.
I didn't translate them, but I did talk. I was very excited and talked to them all about them. That's certainly true. That's right.
Okay, well, that's sadly it is.
Yeah.
Fine.
No.
Here, if you so kind.
to speak a little bit about your Geschichtsphilosophie. I'm a student of Catholic theology, and many of your critics have accused your more historical works of being theological in a bad sense. And many theologians like to appropriate them as overtly theological with great enthusiasm. So I'm wondering, would you characterize any dimension of your philosophical project as theological? And how would you understand more broadly the relationship between philosophy and theology in your own work and programmatically?
Well, I think that, first of all, I'll tell you what I think philosophy ought to be. Philosophy ought not to be a totally separate discipline, though there are issues, I mean, the nature of logic and so on, which belong to it, perhaps in it alone. But for any interesting question that you want to think out, to do the right philosophical work is to integrate other disciplines which are relevant. Like, I mean, history obviously is a case, and sociology and so on. Now, in the sort of total thinking that I'm trying to do, theology plays a role. You know. But one doesn't necessarily thematize that, though I have in other works I've tried to thematize that. So, I mean, briefly to situate myself theologically, I was brought up in Quebec. I was very, very negatively impressed by the highly authoritarian operation of the church there. But we had one advantage in Quebec, that there were two orders, the Jesuits and the Dominicans, who had close relations, the French and Quebec branches of which had very close relations. So the theology of the Nouvelle Théologie, I mean, Delubac, Congar, Chenu, and so on, all these circulated among certain groups in Quebec. We had, groups that were related to Esprit in Paris, etc. Yeah? And so I read all that stuff before Vatican II, and was very, very impressed by it. I mean, kind of Vatican II avant la lettre kind of theology. That's in a nutshell.
Lady with yellow jumper just.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a freshman here. I'm also from Quebec. So, you talked about the hopelessness and the division that we have, which is permanent, that we'll have, and I was wondering if you could talk about if we might be on the verge of having to face with sort of anxiety or angst or more hopelessness even, the sort of division about us. I think about the Société du Spectacle, Guy Debord, and I think about the difference in between sort of science progress and the way we feel things, especially in relation to the environment and nature, because of the mass of scientific data that is gathered now that we can't truly represent to ourselves because of its distanciation in time and in scale. It's just too big to be represented. And how we no longer necessarily feel the same relation to nature. Do you think there could be something in play in the future, especially regarding to climate, and us having to face a sort of bigger anxiety in this division within ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the way I look at it, I don't look at it with hopelessness. At least I try not to look at it and so negatively or as a ground of being hopeless, but rather I'm aware of the fact that yes, our relation to nature changes when we begin to see it mainly through natural science terms, or when we begin to react to it and try to control it by the technology that arises from that. But I note that precisely when this is happening, there are attempts to reconnect with nature. So there is another way in which I find the Romantic period extremely interesting, because there as it were, the whole movement. I'm thinking I'm going to write something about romantic poetics I'm working on now. This is coming from there. That you have at one and the same time a ceasing really to take seriously certain notions of cosmic order, which were thought to be absolutely unquestionable before, right? And that what goes along with that, what comes out of that, is an attempt in this case, poetry, to reconnect, right, with nature, but in another register where it isn't presented as some kind of unquestionable truth, but it's presented as a kind of, as the what can create a sense of connection. So I'm thinking of, if you take on one hand Wordsworth, on the other hand Hölderlin, on the other hand, well, it works out differently in the French. It's very interesting in the French case, but the sense of our Lamartine gives one this very strong sense of the tentativeness of our relation, our understanding of nature, right? It's still there, but in another register. And then you move on, and there's certain things can be said about Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Rilke and so on. So all of this, or Hopkins, to take another case, right? Here you get a kind of poetry and a kind of relation to nature that would have been inconceivable if we'd been back in the era when the great chain of being was unquestionably, part of our world. no question of doubting it. It's a kind of has a lot of embodiment in it. I mean, the Hopkins is very interesting because of the idea of the inscape and the attempt to capture the inscape, which is connected. I think you can see connections to Rilke, reading Rodin, and so on. And so what, all right, maybe we're saying, the optimist says the glass is half full and the pessimist half empty. You're saying we become disconnected from ways in which we were linked to the world around us. And I'm saying, yeah. And what's happening is various attempts at reconnection of a rather interesting kind. See? And so, despair not.
I'm listening to your very, very interesting replies. Priya, if you kindly pass the mic there, to remind me of two episodes in our earlier acquaintance, and I think I want to remind you of them if you've forgotten. In the 1970s, this is provoked by Katrina's question. In the 1970s, in the 1970s, your fellow Montrealer Jerry Cohen wrote a famous book on Marx, Karl Marx's Theory of History, A Defense. And as that book was coming out, you hosted a seminar which you gave jointly with Jerry, which was really an occasion for Jerry to take on all comers, as he loved to do, as we remember. So I was a graduate student in those days and as eager to join the conversation then as I am now. And I remember there was one session in which you had, as always, made some criticisms, and I'd also made some criticisms. And the next week, he arrived with a handout which he distributed to all the 50 members of the seminar called Summa contra Hegelianus.
That's right.
I'm not sure how much I deserved it, and I'm not sure how much you did. But I also remember with great affection, that in those days, Oxford had an absolutely fantastic professor of German, a man called S.S. Praver.
Oh, wonderful, yeah.
Wonderful man, whose book, all of his books I strongly recommend, but whose book, Karl Marx and World Literature, should be on everybody's reading list who has even a vague interest in these matters. And he was very conscientious. He was one of the last of that émigré German generation. And he very conscientiously would lecture to a lot of rather unimaginative students of the German language. And I remember you and I went to his Hölderlin lectures, sitting on school desks, behind school desks at 9 o'clock in the morning, while he gave the most extraordinary exposition and readings of the things. I felt for a short time that I understood Hölderlin. Unfortunately,
it does tend to fade. Yes.
I also have a vivid memory of the two of us sitting there at the back, like interlopers in an audience which didn't seem to be quite as enthused as we were. Anyway,
My name is Eric Beerbaum in the Department of Government and Social Studies. It's not quite Charles Taylor Studies, but you are one of its patron saints in every corner of the program. And my question follows up on your account of present-day populism. It's really an account of the universal asset of mixing the stratification, the wealth inequality, with in-group, out-group tribalism. And I wonder the psychology behind that, your picture of whether, to what extent you would tell a story about victimhood. Are people being manipulated principally to come to have these strong in-group and very powerful negative out-group effective tendencies, or is it one of self-manipulation or simply enabling via flagrant norm violation? And I can imagine, based upon your picture of the person and self-manipulating, self-interpreting creature, a certain answer you might give, but I certainly would love you to phrase it. And then I have to ask, just as a question of phenomenology, kind of like a what is it like to be a bad question. How does one engage in campaigning and then go work on Hegel in the same day? I mean, I just wonder how that's possible. I mean, in some ways, I just want to, there's a proof of concept there, but I'd love to hear more about how that's done.
Yeah. Well, you don't say at the doorstep. Hegel says. That's true. No, but the first question is very interesting because I think it's mixed, but the mix is varied. And if you look at different situations, you find different kinds of ways in which, certainly different kinds of resentments of other people being better treated and so on, mixing with different kinds of appeals on the part of the demagogue, right? So it's even in Germany, right, a very interesting work is being done to see who votes AfD, right? Who gets into that particular party. And of course, there's an awful lot of just being uncomfortable with all these foreigners and Muslims, and then that whipped up with the idea that they're dangerous, that they're jihadi, and so on, like Chemnitz, all this recent demonstration. There's some of that. But, you know, there, interestingly enough, there are some people who are voting AfD who are, again, disadvantaged in various ways, not as tall as badly as Appalachia, but their standard of living is not being maintained, and very often the local services are being cut and so on, right? So they feel hard done by. And they say, you know, when Merkel says, wir schaffen das, and so on, we're going to help these refugees, they feel these people are just outsiders. Now, they're not saying that about fellow inhabitants of Germany. They're saying that about people who are being brought in from outside. So it isn't the same kind of thing as, for instance, American racism about, you know, we come first and the blacks come second, etc., where you're talking about compatriots that are, where another kind of very ugly emotions are involved. Here is just a very understandable, you know, we're not getting served first and these outsiders are being served. I mean, not very noble morally, but much more understanding and much less complex emotionally, right? So I think you have a tremendous variation, but there's some of each. That is, some kind of sense of entitlement, which is really very, very dubious on the part of the people themselves, and some manipulation of this, which rises in certain cases, in the Trump case, to something really spectacular. I mean, he's not going to help those people at all in the end. So it's,
John? Yeah. No.
Thank you. John, I'm a graduate student in political theory. I guess by way of sequel to Eric's question about kind of right-wing populism, I'm curious your view on the left, and both kind of as a sociological picture and also as a matter of continuity or change, that there's kind of seemingly re-energized left flanks in the US and Britain, perhaps in France. And I'm wondering the extent to which you see those as continuities with the left of 50, 60 years ago, as discontinuities, and kind of your assessment there?
Yeah, I think there are great continuities, but I mean the situation is different, so you need a different kind of program, so you can't just sort of carry on without, but there is definitely continuities there. And I think that very often the word populist is used to apply equally left and right. I think there's a mistake there because the exclusionary rhetoric is on the left. I mean, you may doubt the validity and success of the program, but it's a quite different kind of animal from the point of view because it's not this marriage of discontent with exclusion.
Thank you.
Large numbers of people. Lady with the green shirt.
Hi, my name's Tania. I'm a philosophy major at UMass Lowell. My question is, do you think that there are thresholds for claims of sovereignty within a nation? And if so...
I think that there are...
Thresholds for claims of sovereignty within a nation? And if so, where might they be?
Well, I think there again, that's very much different from, country to country, place to place. I mean, think about Aboriginal sovereignty. It's never been extinguished in Canada, but obviously we're not going to talk about totally independent society joining the UN, right? So these are so particular to particular societies and particular cultures that now there are thresholds in a case where you have a self-understood multinational society like Yugoslavia was, right? And like in a certain sense Canada is, except that the kinds of sovereignty is very different from case to case, so that you have tiered sovereignties in a certain sense. But maybe I haven't got your question, but I don't see a use for the word threshold here.
Sure. So I'm working on my honors thesis right now, and I'm thinking about the question of dignity, and I was sort of in my mind make an analogy between autonomous states and autonomous beings, and whether or not there's gradations, I guess, or degrees to autonomy, and thinking about it in relation to nations, whether there's degrees to which somebody or a nation can claim that it's sovereign.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to work where you have multinational, as Spain also maybe should be. You have to work out degrees of sovereignty in order to have a...
Lady with the purple, Larry,
Thank you. I have to say I've been a big fan of your work since, I don't know, many decades ago. I'm Ranju Her. I do research in political philosophy and nationalism and multiculturalism. And I think in a way it's a follow-up question to the previous question. And so when it comes to nationalism, there is a tendency among political philosophers to divide between liberal nationalism versus non-liberal, saying that the first is justifiable, morally justifiable, while the second is not. And I think a real-life example of that would be in Canada, exactly, because Quebecois, their brand of nationalism is definitely liberal, right? A European brand. But when it comes to indigenous nationalism, I think it's a bit different because they do not advocate liberal values. And so, I was wondering what your view is about so-called non-liberal nationalism.
Well, I mean, illiberal nationalism, Orban is claiming the title himself is not a title that is put on by others. He's claiming himself the title. And that, I mean, there's all sorts of terrible things wrong with that, among which is the attempt to make your government unreversible, right, by stacking the deck. And the same thing can be said about Poland. When you come to Aboriginals, however, what you have is a totally different situation in which the issue of in, out, belonging, not belonging is really absolutely crucial to them because they have to. So I don't see them as illiberal necessarily. So I guess what we need is a closer zero in on what we mean by liberal. Now,
So, I fully agree that illiberal is a very loaded term,
Yeah.
and it depends on how you define it. But when I use the term non-liberal, it just means that there are cultural values that are shared by a community,
Yeah.
where the cultural values are not about promoting individual freedom of each member. Rather, it has to do with promoting some kind of common good. It may or may not, the kind of, I'm not saying that in those communities, freedom of individuals recognized is non-existent, but the degree of individual freedom would be much less than what is advocated in liberalism, for example. So, the reason why I think of indigenous peoples as being non-liberal rather than liberal is because, they want to advocate their culture and their cultural institutions and, praxis and so on, not so much about, maximizing individual freedom for every member of that community. So that is how I would define non-liberal nationalism. But I don't quite know what you mean by illiberal nationalism. How does that?
I mean, this is a word that Orban uses himself, right?
Who?
Viktor Orban, who's the...
Oh, I haven't read him,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't know what he's talking about. But
You don't need to read...
Let's watch the TV.
Okay, but so you think
no,
that...
but I mean, I think that, yes,
Yeah.
every society has to maintain some features of itself in order to be itself and so on. And, it's going to be different from different societies. And freedom is never totally limitless in any kind of society. We pay taxes, as somebody was saying there earlier. And so I don't recognize a difference in principle here. I recognize a difference in situation and what we want to maintain in common as against what we want between society and society, but I don't see a different philosophical position.
Thank you.
George Silava.
Do you see any possible path to a benign utopia, however distant?
A benign
Utopia.
Well, utopias are by definition benign, but I mean they don't. I was against dystopias, but I don't.
Well, do you think did Isaiah Berlin ever pronounce the word without a slight curl of disgust?
Without a
Slight curl of disgust, Isaiah.
Oh,
the utopia was not a...
Not everyone thinks about.
Not everyone thinks of it as positively freighted.
yeah. Well, yes. I mean, by definition, it's positively freighted because it's it's dystopia is how we describe. But I see the point. In other words, he's saying, what as I was saying is that there isn't really a place for utopian thinking in real political life. Yeah, but there is a place, but it's not the one that maybe he was targeting. The place is, if you can imagine these very different societies, you get a perspective on your society, which may bring up certain things that you really don't think ought to be there and that maybe you could work against. But if you think that something like Thomas More's utopia could actually exist, no, I don't think so. Not in.
So a Kantian utopian, not a Hegelian or Marxist utopian. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Lady with the hand up just there, yeah.
Thank you. Naomi Sheeman, retired philosophy professor, University of Minnesota. Getting back to something that has come up a number of times, you brought it up, and the person next to me brought it up, giving advice to different countries. Thinking specifically of the situation of nations, for example, European nations dealing with migrants. And I'm wondering if you could say something about what you see as the resources for maintaining and building on a national identity, a sense of the place as a nation that is nonetheless non-exclusionary and capable of welcoming in people from different cultures. And one thought that occurred to me in the question that was asked by, she doesn't seem to be there anymore, the young woman, and your response to it about nature, was wondering whether one such resource might be landscape, seasons, weather, and so on. But what you might say about that general problem of rather specific, not utterly general or universal national identity that nonetheless is welcoming to migrants and others from different cultures.
Well, it's a national identity. I mean, this is the way there's been a lot of attempt to theorize this in Canada. But there, I mean, read two words, multiculturalism and interculturalism. Let's talk about Quebec interculturalism. If you accept that the national identity, which we receive from people, behind us in history, is constantly to be redefined in terms of the people who are there, what their possibilities are, what their backgrounds are, and so on, so that it's something constantly to be revised and continued by in original ways. If that's the understanding, then to the extent that, let's put this in, to the extent that that's the understanding, the fear, the cultural fear that very often is aroused when different kinds of people, different kinds of religion come, will abate. And that is very key to this is the importance of narrative. The national identity is connected to a narrative. And there are different kinds of narrative. And a narrative which is future-oriented and which sees the possible contribution that new people arriving can make is one that is open and ready to accept a lot of people. And the narrative which is focused on the past and so on is very often one which within which the presence of these people arouses fear, right? So when you get, the Germans talking about a light culture, we've got to have a leading culture. In other words, we've got to preempt any change that these people might make in who we are, as against the intercultural. So what you find in our societies is a battle of narratives is going on.
So what would you suggest for the country I have in mind that I know the most about is Sweden, which doesn't have an intercultural sense of itself as part of its national identity. What do you suggest as resources for moving toward that?
Well, you need examples. You see, the thing is that this doesn't get traction until there are people who are very successfully, and this is a little bit chicken and egg problem. I mean, people who have successfully integrated and are very much part of the society, but obviously come from elsewhere. I mean, sometimes we have a couple of singers in Quebec from Africa and so on, and people really relate to them. Chansonniers, people really relate to them. So this is an example, a very concrete example. Someone comes from elsewhere, makes a real contribution, affects our culture, but right. So you need a certain amount. Now the Swedes have been, all Scandinavian countries have been living pretty well in a complete sort of ethnic unity until recently. Now the terrible electoral disaster of the last month in Sweden, because they took in 1 million people in a very short space of time. It's very, this doesn't prejudge the longer term, because when there are more examples and so on, and there are a few, you can hope to do this. But this is, you have to, I mean, it's exactly the kind of battle we're in Quebec. So I really, I sympathize with it and I understand it. We're in a kind of race. Don't do anything irreversibly bad that divides people, but try to make sure people meet each other as much as possible. Try to, faire valoir this particular story and the particular cases that bear it out and so on, and hope that you can keep ahead of the game and keep moving in that direction. But there, I wish I had a neater formula.
Hi, Peter Gordon,
Sorry, Peter.
long-term member of the Charles Fitztaylor fan club. I wanted to ask a somewhat more philosophical question about the theme of self-interpreting animals, or broadly speaking, the tradition of hermeneutics or the HHH theory tradition to which you've devoted so much of your work and from which I've learned a great deal. And I wanted to ask about the tension, if we could put it that way, between the sort of hermeneutic holism promoted by that tradition and your understanding of it, and the tradition of critical theory in the narrow sense, chiefly as represented by Habermas. And the tension I have in mind here is the way in which hermeneutic holism, even when it involves very dramatic forms of reinterpretation, tends to presuppose that forms of rational criticism are always in some sense founded, or that taking a certain kind of distance from one's own culture is always going to be in some ultimate sense limited or constrained by the fact that you yourself belong to that culture. In other words, it reinforces a sense of an insidership, and you might say tends to diminish our understanding of our rational capacity to take a kind of critical distance from our own hermeneutic entanglements. So this is just it's an invitation for you to reflect upon possible differences that you might feel you have from critical theory, and the place of rational criticism in the HHH tradition.
You see, I think that that's just a mistake, the idea that having a strong sense of your own identity makes it impossible to criticize. Because the implication would be that I could stand totally outside this identity and just apply rational criteria, whatever the word is. I think it's a really deep mistake. I think that even an absence, I hate to say this, or friends like Habermas and so on, but even an absence of self-consciousness about how, and in a way, or maybe it's not fair. I mean, maybe that other facet of one's being comes out for Habermas in the notion of constitutional patriotism, right? That what we're proud of is the German tradition, the Paulskirche in 1848, right? And so that kind of gets naturalized within the critical tradition, and therefore it's lived quite happily as an identity, right? But so maybe the absence, the problem is a lack of imagination that something similar could be going on in another quite different kind of tradition, and it plainly is. I mean, to answer the earlier question, the whole issue in something like a theory of interculturalism, a narrative of interculturalism, is that you're both very much living what came from the past, and you're also asking questions about it. What must be changed? What must be opened? And,
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say all good things must come to an end, but they can't come to an end without saying thank you so much to Chuck for giving us the most extraordinary